Welcome back. We're still working with our 236 here. We've freed up the fuel cap and replaced the gasket. We've fixed the dry pump, we've oiled it, and we've fixed the stuck check valve. So now we're ready for a test fire. I've already put a mantle on here and burned it in. It's not a Coleman 111, which is what was designed for this. Those are getting expensive these days. So what I've got on here is a cheap butterfly mantle from China. It's a Petromax mantle clone. Not a great mantle, but it'll work for testing. So I'm going to pump this up for starters. Make sure the valve is closed. The valve is closed, the fount is full of pressure. Now this lantern gives me some cause for concern. I'm not seeing any wet spots on the bottom, I'm not seeing any pinholes, I'm not seeing any stress cracks or holes in the fount. I'm not hearing any hissing or hearing any pressure leaks, but there are a couple things here that are cause for concern. One, around the collar, all of these openings show evidence that there was a gas leak and it carried soot with the gas. So that tells me it had a leak or something at some point. Now I suspect someone simply flooded it. Either they didn't know how to light it or the instant-lite circuit wasn't working properly. So, I'm going to do a quick inspection before we go any further. Take the burner off. Look underneath, it's covered in thick black soot. So again, that confirms my theory that there was a fire in the collar here. And the collar itself is covered in soot inside. I can also see that the valve stem, someone had to put a wrench on there, pliers on it, in order to get it to turn. It is quite tight. That's probably not the issue here, but that is something we need to look at with the valve. Just to rule these out, I'm going to make sure the generator tip is secure, which it is, because if that's loose, that could cause a leak. And the jam nut on the generator is tight. So nothing's leaking here. I don't see any obvious cause for a leak, so my expectation is that somebody flooded this, either because they didn't know what they were doing, or because the instant-lite circuit isn't working properly. If that's the case, then we'll pull the valve and we'll take care of that. Either the spring that lifts the air stem or the air wire in the fuel and air tube is compressed, which wouldn't surprise me. It's been since 1955, and it's not lifting the air wire out of the fuel pickup orifice, or the fuel pickup orifice is clogged with gunk, which is also highly possible since this is from 1955. So before I light anything, we've got pressure. I've got a fire extinguisher handy. This is a strange lantern. I haven't lit it yet. Don't know what could happen. I've done a safety inspection. I don't see any reason why it's going to leak or do anything bizarre, but I've got a fire extinguisher handy just in case. I'll put the globe on. Even though it's broken, it'll still get the job done. All right, so quarter turn. There's an issue here. Clean the generator. Let's try that again. Okay, it's trying. Let's see if I shake it. All right, that confirms my theory. If you shake the lantern and it's full of gas, you'll get, if the fuel pickup orifice is clogged, It'll keep the instant-lite circuit from working properly. But if you shake it, you'll get some gas into the air holes at the top of the fuel and air tube, and it will light. So I've got some gas in there, I heard it. It's trying. I see, yep, it is. It's going to flood. Maybe, maybe not. There we go. I can almost guarantee that we've got, and we do have a leak here from the jam nut, which means the stem may need to be cleaned up, our graphite packing may be bad, or it may just need to be tightened. So, we've got a number of issues going on here. It certainly looks like the instant-lite circuit is not working the way it should. That may mean the spring is compressed, the fuel pickup orifice may be clogged, and we've got a leak in the valve in the jam nut here that we need to deal with. So at this point, we're going to tear the whole thing down. It's not hot. We can let the pressure out. I'm going to take the burner off. Set that aside. Move the collar. And take the generator off. So it appears I think the fuel pickup orifice is clogged because it looks like it's getting a little bit of fuel, but not enough to actually get running. All right, I've drained the fuel from the fount. What I'm going to do is put a piece of cardboard around the valve so I don't chew it up in the vise jaws. Tighten this in there. It doesn't need to be super tight, it just needs to not move. Now, because this fount is brass, they all have steel bottoms, but in Canada, up until the late 60s or about 1970, most of the founts were brass, which means they can bend easily if the torque is off center at all. So I need to be careful and not do that. If you've got a steel fount, it's not a problem, but with brass, it's soft. So, and it takes quite a bit of pressure for it to break free. All right. There we go. Okay. And I can see right now that the fuel pickup orifice is clogged. I'm surprised. The pickup tube is actually pretty clean. I half expected it to be covered in green gunk, which is usually how these old lanterns are if they've never been cracked open. But this actually isn't too bad, but something is clogging this, I can see in there. So I'm going to take the valve apart. We'll go back over to the workbench and I'll show you how to do that. And once that's done, we'll take it in the house and throw it in some citric acid and boil it out. All right, here's our valve. It's pretty easy to take apart. If you watched the theory of operation video on the how the instant-lite lanterns works, you saw much of this. So we'll begin, do it left-handed here so you can see. Take off the knob. a screw and a disc, and that actually popped off very nicely. We'll take off the fuel and air tube, and we'll probably find some more problem in here. Yeah, there's something clogging it up. That's the fuel pickup orifice. This is the air wire, and there isn't a whole lot of spring left in that spring, so that may be part of our problem too. When the valve is open all the way, the spring just isn't lifting this far enough out of the orifice, so it's not getting enough fuel. So we'll just stretch that back out when we're done. Now, one of my concerns is the valve packing here. Oh, and that's extremely loose. All right. Let's take that out. There we go. If you keep turning it after it stops, what will happen is you'll back the valve stem out with the packing. And this packing actually looks like it's probably okay. This is a graphite cylinder, and that's what keeps it from leaking. Let's see if I can back that off. I don't think it's going to want to back off. But for now, I'm going to put this back together and we'll clean that up with some citric acid and see if we can get it to work again. If not, it may need to be repacked. The cleaning lever, everything here is working fine. The graphite packing in these, oh, someone's messed with this too. I'm just going to tighten that up. It was probably seized up at some point and someone tried to loosen it and never tightened it back up. That's good, and that works. This raises the cleaning needle in the generator. So the rest of this, I'm just going to leave it as it is and see if we can get that cleaned up. I'm going to take this valve assembly and these components and we're going to put them in some citric acid. And while we wait for that, I'm going to clean up this fount and prepare it for another video where we'll show you how to polish up a fount. This looks like it'll clean up pretty nicely. It's in pretty good shape. It'll have some freckles on it, but it looks like someone hit it with a Scotch-Brite pad and it's got some scratches in it. So we'll see if we can buff all of that out. So, see you in the kitchen. All right, welcome to the kitchen again. In the small pan over here, I've got the valve components. The only thing I haven't put in there is the valve stem itself because it'd destroy this graphite packing. So I'm going to take steel wool to this and then a buffing wheel on my bench grinder. Since I'm going to clean up this entire lantern, I've thrown all of the brass components in this pan of citric acid to clean them up, and I'll polish them up later. Over here in the larger pan, I've got the larger items. Ideally, you don't want to put brass and steel in the same pot of acid solution. Since I can't take apart the burner assembly, it's got a little bit of mixed metal in there. Some of that's brass, some of that's steel. I've got the collar and I've got the bail in there as well because those take a larger pot. But I'm trying to keep those steel items separate from the brass items as much as possible so that the brass or the steel doesn't end up turning pink on me. So we'll come back to this in a while after everything's cleaned up. Everything's clean. As you'll see, I didn't just clean the valve components in citric acid. I cleaned them off afterward, rinsed them well with water to get the acid solution off, and I wiped them down with steel wool. And since I was polishing the fount on the buffing wheel, I went ahead and took all these brass pieces to the buffing wheel as well. I used a medium firm wheel and some white jeweler's rouge, and you can see how shiny that gets everything. Doesn't stay that way forever, it does tarnish, and once it gets hot, things like the generators will turn black pretty quickly. But it'll look good now. You can take some good pictures before you fire it up for the first time, and it'll look pretty. So, we've got our valve body. The one thing I noticed when we took it apart was that both jam nuts, the valve stem nut and the nut on the tip cleaning lever, were barely finger tight, if that. So before I do a whole lot with this, I'm going to cinch that up. It's firm. We'll check it for leaks when it's running, but that feels like it should be about right. This should turn freely. If it's too loose, it'll leak, but if you tighten this too much, it won't turn easily. The same goes for the valve stem. Hopefully this graphite valve packing is still good. It looks like it should be. Now on this 236, if I pull this apart, you can see this is the graphite packing. It's a cylinder of graphite. There's right here, there's a brass ring that's crimped on. This keeps everything from sliding forward. There's a brass cylinder on a narrow one, and it's got a dish or a cup in the front end of it. So if you ever need to take one of these wire rings off and you're worried about putting it back on and it not being shaped quite properly, don't worry about it. This cylinder will fit around it, and the first time you tighten the valve stem down, it will conform to this cylinder, and it'll be shaped properly after that. The graphite packing sits behind that, and then there's another cylinder that sits inside the valve stem nut. This isn't the case on every lantern. Many models lack this part, and the graphite packing will actually crush into the valve stem nut and be held in here, which makes it more difficult to replace. But this has a cylinder, so it's squeezed between these two. What happens is this nut will go over those, and we'll tighten down on these threads on the valve body. And as it tightens, this valve packing will come under pressure. It squeezes against the valve stem. It also squeezes out against the walls of the nut, and that keeps fuel from leaking out. Now, if the packing goes bad, it can get sticky, so it holds onto the valve stem, makes it difficult to turn, or it simply wears out and leaks. Hopefully that's not a problem on this, and I don't think it will be. I can do another video where I can show you how to replace this. You can buy new valve packings, factory valve packings from places like old Coleman parts. That's not convenient for me, so I use a graphite packing rope that I buy at a plumbing supply house, and I can show you how to do that in one of these videos. So the first thing we're going to do is thread in the valve stem, put the knob on there just to make sure it's tight. So all right, we've got the valve packing in. I had to rest this on the vise and tap it into place. We've got it in. One thing I want to check before I do much more, and the valve stem itself is turning nice and free. So that's a good sign. Now this nut, that feels about right. Not loose, not so tight we can't turn it. It would have been a little looser or smoother than that from the factory, but unfortunately we'll never get it back there without replacing the valve packing entirely. Now, what was wrong with this, the orifice on the bottom was plugged. That has been cleaned out. We boiled this out. I ran the air wire through. It's moving freely. The other problem was that this lifter spring is almost completely compressed. So what happens is, if you watch the theory of operation video,
this air wire plugs that fuel pickup orifice when the valve is closed, and when the valve is opened, the valve stem backs off and this pops up. The spring lifts it. But in this case, the spring isn't lifting enough because it's compressed. So all we have to do is stretch it out a bit. And that should be more than enough. Put that on there. Remember, this goes underneath this shoulder so that it pulls it out of the fuel and air tube rather than pushing it down in. And then that threads into the bottom of the valve body. Now, some of these have something you can grab with a wrench. Some of them don't. Some of them are just round. You can use pliers on those. Just don't over tighten it because it's soft brass. You can snap the threads off if you're not careful. Now, the valve body is back together. Time to put it in the fount. Now, to clock this properly, we want the knob over the Coleman logo. It was slightly off before. Someone may have taken it apart. It's hard to say. One of the problems with these is it's hard to get it as tight as it was originally once it's been taken out. And you want to put it down far enough so that this is close to the bottom of the fount without touching the bottom. So you want it, you want it down there good and tight. It probably doesn't need thread locker because this is a tapered thread, but if for some reason you can't get it as tight as it was, some thread locker on here will help prevent any leakage, and it will also give you a little wiggle room if you need to adjust it a bit to clock it, where it's not quite as tight as you'd like. So I'm going to put just a little bit on each side. And we'll spin this in, and depending on what happens, we may need to take it over to the vise. Yep, we need to take it over to the vise because we need to go just a bit tighter than that. So, I'll be right back. All right, here we go. We've got it pinched in the vise. Again, I've got the valve stem here. So, I want to turn. And I want to apply even torque, otherwise I can bend this brass fount. Almost there. And there we go. Just a tiny bit more. And we're centered right over the Coleman Sunshine logo. It's exactly what we want. The next thing I'm going to do is put the collar back on. Put it through the cleaning lever through, and then pull it around, snap it over the valve nut, and that's on. Now I'll turn the valve cleaning lever up to expose the eccentric block. I've got the cleaning needle threaded through the tube and spring. You want to hook that in the hole, turn it down, and then slide the generator body over the top. And then tighten that nut. Again, this needs to be tight, but don't overdo it. That brass is what causes it to seal. Otherwise you'll have a leak out of the bottom of your generator. Now you'll notice that I left the tip off. That's because sometimes when you slide that needle back in, if it's not centered properly, it may hit inside here and not come up through the orifice in the top, and then you end up with a bent needle. So what I like to do once I've got the generator on is put the tip up. I can see the needle here. At this point, I'll slide the fuel tip over the top and screw it down and verify that I can see it moving up and down through the hole. And now I'll tighten that. And again, this, just snug. You don't want it to leak, you'll end up with fuel everywhere. but if it's too tight, or if you over tighten it, it can snap off. Now the valve knob, again that feels about right. Put the direction disc in place. And the screw. The large hole is for the generator. The small one is for this stud on the valve. Make sure the generator feeds into the hole in the manifold. This is the time to get your collar centered. And we'll put the wing nut on. Now, some of these may have just a plain hex nut. The later models in the 80s or even in the 70s, I think, used a PAL nut. All right, we're almost done. I left this burner cap off because it's interesting. I like finding these, they're kind of neat. I don't know when they used them in the States or if they used them at all. I think they did. But here in Canada, they used these ceramic burner caps from 1953 to 1955. You find them on 200s and on 236s and 237s. I think you can find them on 242Bs on occasion. They're just kind of neat. The cap itself is ceramic and it floats inside this brass fitting and tube. And it's knurled on the outside, so you can tighten this by hand. Just stick it up there in the manifold. Tighten the threads. This is one to be careful with, especially if you do put pliers on this to get it off if it's tight. This is ceramic. The actual cap itself, it can break. So, something to keep in mind. Now, I've set aside the broken globe. This one I think is period with the red sunshine logo. They may have introduced that a couple years later, but I think this is the same as the one that came on here because it's broken just perfectly to break out that logo. And I can tell you exactly what happened when I got this. The bail was not on it. The vent nut was extremely tight, and the vent, you can see there are holes in the manifold for the bail, and these holes in the vent were not lined up with it. So I can guarantee what somebody did, and this is something to be careful of. Someone tried to put the bail in while it wasn't lined up with the holes. They put it in, and on one side it hit the top of the glass and took that chunk out. So we're going to make sure it's lined up properly. Screw the vent nut on. This doesn't need to be super tight. In fact, if it is tight, when the vent heats up, you may end up with chipping because the vent will expand. And there we go. A thing of beauty. She's all cleaned up. I think she looks miles better than when I found her. And give me a break. I'll put a mantle on there. We'll pour some gas in and we'll fire her up. Okay, I pulled the camera back so you can see the whole thing now. I think we had it cut off in the previous frame. We're ready to light. It's full of gas. It's full of pressure. I've put a vintage 1950s number 111 mantle on here. It's designed for 500 candle power, which is what the 236 is rated for. Should be nice and bright. Put our match in there. Open a quarter turn. There we go. Hope you enjoyed this video. There will be more, but our 236 is working. We'll have to look for another model now. But thanks for watching. See you next time.